Hey guys, tonight we journey back to one of history's most devastating conflicts. Not fought with massive armies or grand battles, but with a single plant that brought the world's most powerful empire to its knees. This is the story of how opium, a simple flowering poppy, destroyed China's greatest dynasty and changed the course of world history forever. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy these calm, late-night journeys into history. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to watch our nighttime community gather from all across the world for these deeper stories. Now, dim the lights, adjust your pillow, and let the world quiet down around you. Tonight, we drift into a chapter of history shaped not by armies or empires alone, but by a single flower, a poppy that reshaped nations. In this episode, we'll explore how a trade dispute over tea spiraled into a drug war that shattered an empire, how British merchants became the world's largest drug dealers, and how the consequences of these conflicts still echo through China today. This isn't just a story about war. It's about addiction, greed, cultural collision, and the terrible price of imperial ambition. By the time we're done tonight, you'll understand how a flower changed the world, and why the Chinese still call this period the Century of Humiliation. Picture this. It's the year 1800, and you're standing on the docks of Canton, the only Chinese port where foreigners are allowed to trade. The air is thick with the smell of tea, silk, and spices. Ships from across the world bob in the harbor, their holds empty, waiting to be filled with Chinese treasures. And towering over it all is the most powerful, most prosperous empire the world has ever seen. China in the 1800s wasn't just another kingdom. It was the economic superpower of the world. The Qing dynasty controlled a territory larger than modern Europe, ruled over 300 million people, and produced more than 1/3 of everything made on the entire planet. Think about that for a moment. One country making 1/3 of the world's goods. That would be like if the modern United States, Japan, and Germany's economies were all combined into one massive superpower. The Chinese emperor wasn't just a king. He was the son of heaven, the divine ruler of the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization itself. From his perspective, China was the world, and everything else was just barbarian lands on the periphery. And honestly, looking at the numbers, he had a point. European merchants weren't trading partners. They were supplicants, begging for the privilege of buying Chinese goods. The Chinese had invented paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass. They had silk so fine you could see through it, porcelain so delicate it seemed magical, and tea so perfect that entire nations had restructured their daily routines around drinking it. But here's where it gets interesting, and where the seeds of disaster were already being planted. The Chinese didn't want anything the Europeans had to offer. Nothing. European goods were crude, inferior, unnecessary. When British merchants arrived with their woolens and manufactured items, Chinese officials basically yawned and said, "Thanks, but we're good." So how did trade work? Simple. Europeans brought silver. Lots and lots of silver. They'd sail halfway around the world, unload chests of precious metal, and sail home with holds full of tea, silk, and porcelain. It was the ultimate one-way trade relationship, and it was bleeding Europe dry. The British East India Company, the massive corporation that controlled much of Britain's Asian trade, was hemorrhaging silver. Every year, millions of pounds worth of precious metal flowed into China and never came back. The British treasury was being drained, and something had to change. But the Chinese system seemed unbreakable. They had everything they needed within their own borders. Their agriculture was sophisticated, their craftsmanship unmatched, their population enormous and productive. They controlled the trade routes, set the prices, and dictated the terms. Foreign merchants could only trade in Canton, only through approved Chinese intermediaries, and only according to Chinese rules. The most powerful of these intermediaries was a man named Haokua, who was quite possibly the richest individual on the planet. His personal fortune was estimated at around $26 million, which doesn't sound impressive until you realize that's equivalent to multiple billions in today's money. This guy literally had rooms filled with silver, and during a fire in 1822, witnesses described rivers of molten silver flowing through the streets as his vaults melted. The Chinese system was called the Canton system. and it was designed to keep foreigners at arm's length while extracting maximum profit from them. Foreign merchants could only live in designated areas outside the city walls called factories, not manufacturing plants, but trading houses. They couldn't bring their wives or families. They couldn't learn Chinese. They couldn't travel into the Chinese interior. And most importantly, they could only trade through approved Chinese merchants. It was humiliating for the Europeans, but it worked perfectly for China. The empire was stable, prosperous, and secure. The emperor received tribute from neighboring kingdoms, the population was fed and clothed, and Chinese culture was flourishing. Art, literature, and philosophy were reaching new heights. It seemed like the Qing dynasty would last forever, but there was a problem brewing, one that would eventually bring this entire system crashing down. The British had found something the Chinese wanted, something that would reverse the flow of silver, create millions of addicts, and ultimately destroy the world's greatest empire. That something was opium. Now, opium wasn't new to China. It had been used medicinally for centuries, usually eaten or drunk as a tincture to treat pain or illness. But something changed when Europeans introduced the practice of smoking it. Suddenly, what had been a medicine became something far more dangerous, a drug that could create instant, powerful addiction. At first, opium smoking was confined to the wealthy elite, government officials, rich merchants, men of leisure. It was a luxury drug, a status symbol, but that was about to change in ways that would shake the foundations of Chinese civilization. The British East India Company had vast opium plantations in Bengal, in what is now India and Bangladesh. They were producing thousands of chests of the drug every year, and they had found the perfect market for it: China. The only problem was that opium was illegal in China, banned by imperial decree. But when had a little thing like legality ever stopped determined merchants from making enormous profits? By 1800, around 4,500 chests of opium were being smuggled into China annually. Each chest contained about 140 pounds of the drug. That's over 600,000 pounds of opium flowing into China every year, and demand was growing rapidly. The Chinese government was starting to notice. Local officials were reporting increasing problems with addiction, particularly among government workers and soldiers. Tax collection was becoming difficult as more and more people spent their money on opium instead of paying their obligations to the state. But the full scope of the crisis was still hidden from the imperial court in Beijing, thousands of miles away from the southern ports where the drug was entering the country. The emperor and his advisors still believed they were dealing with a minor smuggling problem, not a national catastrophe in the making. They had no idea that they were about to face the most devastating challenge in Chinese history, a challenge that would come not from armies or natural disasters, but from a simple flower that produced a milky sap. A flower that would bring the celestial empire to its knees and change the balance of power in the world forever. The stage was set for one of history's most tragic conflicts. On one side, the world's oldest continuous civilization, confident in its superiority and secure in its traditions. On the other, a rising industrial power desperate to break into Chinese markets and willing to use any means necessary to do so. Between them lay opium, the drug that would transform a trade dispute into a war into a century of humiliation, and a proud empire into a broken nation struggling to survive in a world that had suddenly become very dangerous indeed. Let's talk about opium itself, the innocent-looking flower that would bring down an empire. The opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, doesn't look particularly threatening. It's actually quite beautiful, delicate petals in white, pink, or purple, swaying gently in the breeze. But hidden within its seed pod is a milky latex that contains some of the most powerful psychoactive compounds known to humanity. When you score the surface of an opium pod with a knife, a white sap oozes out. As this sap dries, it turns brown and sticky, forming raw opium. This substance contains morphine, codeine, and dozens of other alkaloids that can relieve pain, induce euphoria, and create devastating addiction. For thousands of years, opium had been used as medicine. Ancient Sumerians called it the joy plant. Greek physicians prescribed it for everything from headaches to heartbreak. Arab traders carried it along the Silk Road. But it was always consumed in small quantities, usually mixed with wine or eaten in tiny amounts. The game changer was smoking. When opium is heated and the vapors inhaled, the drugs reach the brain within seconds, creating an intense, immediate high that's far more powerful and addictive than eating the substance. And it was the Chinese who perfected this method of consumption, ironically creating the very technique that would destroy their society. The process was almost ritualistic. The opium was heated over a flame until it bubbled and released sweet, acrid smoke. This smoke was drawn through long pipes, often beautifully crafted works of art, with ornate metal bowls and decorated stems. The user would lie on their side on a wooden platform, drawing the smoke deep into their lungs, then drifting into a dreamlike state that could last for hours. The effects were seductive. One puff and your troubles faded away. 2 puffs and you were floating in a warm, comfortable haze. 3 puffs and you were in paradise. Or at least, that's how it felt. Pain disappeared, anxiety vanished, and the harsh realities of life in Qing China faded into the background. But opium was a liar. What felt like paradise was actually a trap, and once you were caught, escape was nearly impossible. The drug rewired the brain's reward system, making normal pleasures seem dull and meaningless. Food lost its taste, sex lost its appeal, even family relationships became secondary to the need for the next pipe. Withdrawal was agony. Without opium, users experienced crushing depression, violent nausea, uncontrollable shaking, and pain so intense it felt like their bones were breaking. The only relief was more opium, and each time you used it, you needed a little more to achieve the same effect. By the 1820s, what had started as an elite indulgence was spreading through Chinese society like wildfire. The drug was becoming cheaper and more available as British merchants ramped up production and smuggling operations. What had once cost a month's wages now cost a day's pay. What had once been confined to wealthy merchants and government officials was now reaching ordinary farmers, craftsmen, and laborers. The social impact was devastating. Imagine a society where a significant portion of the population was addicted to a drug that made them incapable of productive work. Fields went unplanted because farmers were too busy smoking opium. Workshops sat empty because craftsmen had sold their tools to buy drugs. Government offices were staffed by officials who spent their days in opium-induced stupors. Families were torn apart. Fathers sold their children's clothes to buy opium. Mothers pawned their wedding jewelry for one more pipe. Children went hungry while their parents chased the dragon, the term for the elusive perfect high that addicts spent their lives pursuing but never quite achieved. The economic impact was equally catastrophic. For centuries, silver had flowed into China as payment for Chinese goods. Now that silver was flowing back out to pay for opium. The Chinese economy, which had been built on exporting goods and importing precious metals, was suddenly reversed. Instead of accumulating wealth, China was hemorrhaging it. Local officials tried to crack down on the trade, but they faced an impossible situation. Many of their own subordinates were addicted to opium. The smugglers had more money than the government and could afford to bribe officials at every level, and the demand was so enormous that stopping the supply seemed hopeless. The smuggling operations were sophisticated and well organized. British ships would anchor at Linton Island, just outside Chinese territorial waters, and transfer their cargo to fast Chinese boats that could outrun government patrol vessels. These boats would then distribute the opium to dealers throughout southern China, who would sell it to an ever-growing network of opium dens and private users. The British weren't just passive suppliers. They were actively promoting addiction. They employed Chinese agents to recruit new users, offering free samples to get people hooked. They funded the construction of opium dens and provided equipment and training to operators. They even published guides on how to smoke opium most effectively. This wasn't just business, it was chemical warfare. The British had found a way to weaken Chinese society from within, to make the population dependent on a product that only they could supply. Every new addict was a victory for British commerce and a defeat for Chinese civilization. The Chinese government was slow to recognize the full scope of the crisis. Reports from local officials were often ignored or dismissed by the imperial court in Beijing. The emperor and his advisors were focused on traditional threats, rebellions, natural disasters, foreign invasions. They didn't understand that they were facing something entirely new, a form of warfare that attacked not the body but the mind, not the state, but the soul of their civilization. By 1830, the situation had reached crisis proportions. An estimated 2 million Chinese were regular opium users, and the number was growing every day. The drug was no longer confined to the coastal regions where it entered the country. It was spreading inland along trade routes, carried by merchants, soldiers, and government officials. The social fabric of Chinese society was unraveling. Traditional values of hard work, family loyalty, and respect for authority were being eroded by a drug that made such values seem irrelevant. The Confucian ideal of the harmonious society was being replaced by the chaos of mass addiction. Something had to be done. The question was what, and whether it was already too late to save the Celestial Empire from the flower that was destroying it from within. Now, let's talk about the men who turned drug dealing into an art form. The British merchants who built fortunes on Chinese misery and convinced themselves they were doing God's work. These weren't back-alley criminals or desperate smugglers. These were respectable businessmen, pillars of their communities back home, men who attended church on Sundays and donated to charity while poisoning an entire civilization for profit. The most successful of these merchants were William Jardine and James Matheson, two Scotsmen who would eventually found Jardine Matheson and Company, one of the most profitable drug smuggling operations in history. Jardine was a former ship's surgeon who had seen the effects of opium firsthand, but decided that profit trumped medical ethics. Matheson was a calculating businessman who could make addiction sound like a public service. These men weren't just selling opium, they were revolutionizing the drug trade. They developed new smuggling techniques, faster ships, and more efficient distribution networks. They bribed officials, recruited local agents, and created a supply chain that could deliver opium to any corner of China within weeks of production. Their ships were marvels of engineering, designed specifically for the opium trade. Fast clipper ships that could outrun Chinese patrol boats, with hidden compartments for storing drugs and secret signals for communicating with smugglers. The most famous was the Red Rover, a sleek vessel that could make the journey from Calcutta to Canton in just 32 days, carrying enough opium to supply thousands of addicts. But speed wasn't enough. They needed bases of operation. Linton Island became their headquarters, a floating warehouse anchored just outside Chinese territorial waters. Here, British ships would transfer their cargo to Chinese smuggling boats in broad daylight, protected by the fiction that they were in international waters and therefore beyond Chinese jurisdiction. The operation was brazen in its scope and cynical in its execution. British merchants would arrive in Canton with legitimate cargo, cotton, wool, manufactured goods, and conduct normal trade during the day. But at night, they would slip away to Linton Island to oversee the transfer of opium to Chinese smugglers. The profits were staggering. A chest of opium that cost £30 to produce in India could be sold for £100 or more in China. With thousands of chests being smuggled every year, the British merchants were making fortunes that dwarfed the wealth of European nobility. Jardine alone was said to be worth over £1 million by the 1830s, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. But it wasn't just about individual wealth. The opium trade was becoming crucial to the British Empire's finances. The East India Company used opium profits to fund its operations in India. The British government collected taxes on opium production and export. British banks financed the trade, British ships carried the cargo, and British insurance companies covered the risks. What had started as a private venture was becoming a pillar of imperial policy. The merchants developed elaborate justifications for their trade. They argued that they were simply meeting existing demand, not creating it. They claimed that opium was no different from alcohol or tobacco, a luxury product that adults could choose to consume or not. They insisted that Chinese addiction was a result of Chinese moral weakness, not British exploitation. William Jardine famously wrote to a colleague, "We have every reason to believe that the more the Chinese consume, the better it will be for them and for us." This wasn't just cynicism. It was willful blindness to the human cost of their profits. The British merchants also lobbied their government relentlessly, arguing that the opium trade was essential to British interests in Asia. They painted themselves as patriots serving the empire, not drug dealers destroying lives. They funded newspapers and pamphlets that promoted their cause, hired lawyers to defend their legal rights, and cultivated relationships with politicians who could protect their interests. Meanwhile, American merchants were getting in on the action too. Companies like Russell and Company, founded by Samuel Russell, were importing Turkish opium to compete with the British product. The Americans tried to maintain a veneer of respectability, claiming they were only involved in legitimate trade, but their ships carried just as much misery as their British competitors. The most disturbing aspect of this trade was how normalized it became. By the 1830s, opium smuggling was so routine that it was discussed openly in business correspondence, reported in newspapers, and treated as just another commodity like tea or silk. The human cost, the millions of Chinese lives being destroyed, was simply ignored. The merchants developed increasingly sophisticated methods for avoiding Chinese law enforcement. They employed Chinese compradors, local agents who handled the dangerous work of actually distributing the drugs. They used coded language in their correspondence, referring to opium as medicine or provisions. They maintained elaborate networks of safe houses, hidden warehouses, and corrupt officials. The corruption was systematic and pervasive. Chinese customs officials were paid to look the other way. Local magistrates received regular bribes to avoid enforcing anti-opium laws. Even high-ranking government officials were compromised, either through direct payments or by their own addiction to the drug. The British merchants also pioneered new marketing techniques. They offered free samples to potential customers, understanding that addiction would create permanent demand. They targeted specific demographics: government workers, soldiers, students, knowing that these groups would spread the habit to others. They even developed different grades of opium for different social classes, from cheap, low-quality drugs for peasants to premium products for wealthy customers. The scale of the operation was breathtaking. By 1838, over 40,000 chests of opium were being smuggled into China annually. That's about 5.6 million pounds of drugs, roughly equivalent to the weight of 500 elephants. The British had created the largest drug trafficking operation in human history, and they were proud of it. The profits from this trade funded much of Britain's Industrial Revolution. Opium money built railways, factories, and universities. It financed exploration and scientific research. Some of America's most prestigious families, including the ancestors of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, built their fortunes on Chinese addiction. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this story is how the merchants convinced themselves they were the good guys. They saw themselves as bringing civilization to China, opening up a backward nation to the benefits of free trade. They genuinely believed that Chinese resistance to opium was evidence of Chinese ignorance and xenophobia, not a legitimate attempt to protect their people from a devastating drug epidemic. This self-deception would have tragic consequences. When the Chinese government finally decided to take decisive action against the opium trade, the British merchants would cry foul, claiming they were the victims of Chinese aggression. They would demand that their government protect their legitimate business interests with military force. And their government would listen. By 1838, the opium crisis had reached a breaking point. The Daoguang Emperor, sitting in his palace in Beijing, was finally receiving reports that made the scope of the disaster clear. His own officials were addicted. His soldiers were too drugged to fight. His treasury was being drained as silver flowed out of the country to pay for poison. Something had to be done, and the emperor knew exactly who to call: Lin Zexu, the most incorruptible official in the empire. Lin was known as the Iron-Handed Commissioner, a man who had cleaned up corruption in every province he'd governed. If anyone could solve the opium crisis, it was him. Lin Zexu wasn't what you'd expect from an action hero. He was 54 years old, a scholar and civil servant who had spent his career studying Confucian classics and administering government policy. But he had something that made him incredibly dangerous to the opium trade. He was absolutely, completely, utterly incorruptible. In a system riddled with bribery and compromise, Lin was a man who couldn't be bought, threatened, or reasoned with. When the emperor appointed him special imperial commissioner with full powers to end the opium trade, Lin knew he was taking on not just British merchants, but the entire corrupt system that had allowed the crisis to develop. He also knew that failure would mean not just the end of his career, but probably his life. Lin arrived in Canton in March 1839 like a force of nature. Within days, he had arrested over 1,700 Chinese opium dealers and confiscated thousands of pipes and other drug paraphernalia. He ordered the execution of several major dealers as a warning to others. The message was clear: the days of tolerance were over. But Lin's real target wasn't the Chinese dealers. It was the foreign merchants who were supplying them. He issued an ultimatum to the British and American traders: surrender all your opium within 3 days or face severe consequences. The foreign merchants were stunned. They had grown so accustomed to Chinese officials who could be bribed or intimidated that they couldn't believe Lin was serious. They offered him money, threatened him with their government's displeasure, and tried to negotiate a compromise. Lin's response was to surround their factories with Chinese troops and cut off their food and water supplies. For 6 weeks, the foreign community was under siege. They couldn't leave their compounds, couldn't receive supplies, and couldn't communicate with their ships in the harbor. It was a masterful display of pressure without violence. Lin was forcing them to choose between their opium and their lives. Finally, Charles Elliot, the British Superintendent of Trade, made a fateful decision. He ordered all British merchants to surrender their opium to him, promising they would be compensated by the British government. He then handed over the opium to Lin, all 20,283 chests of it, worth about £2 million sterling. What happened next was one of the most dramatic moments in the history of the drug war. Instead of keeping the opium or selling it, Lin ordered its complete destruction. At a beach near the village of Human, workers constructed huge trenches lined with stone. Under Lin's personal supervision, they broke open each chest, dumped the contents into the trenches, and mixed it with salt and lime before flushing it out to sea with water. The process took 23 days. More than 500 workers labored from dawn to dusk, destroying what was then the largest stash of illegal drugs ever seized in history. British merchants watched from boats offshore, horrified to see their fortunes literally going up in smoke. But Lin wasn't finished. He wrote a remarkable letter to Queen Victoria herself, appealing to her moral character and asking her to end the opium trade. "I have heard that in your honorable country, the smoking of opium is strictly forbidden. Since it is not permitted in your own country, then even less should you let it be passed on to harm other countries. How can you bear to make profit from harming others?" The letter was never delivered. British officials intercepted it, but it revealed Lin's fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. He believed he was dealing with a rogue trade that the British government would surely stop once they understood its harmful effects. He didn't realize that the opium trade had become essential to British imperial finances and that his actions would be seen as an act of war. Lin also began strengthening China's coastal defenses, preparing for what he feared might be British retaliation. He recruited local militias, repaired fortifications, and stockpiled weapons, but his preparations were based on traditional Chinese military thinking. He was preparing to fight the wars of the past, not understanding that warfare itself had been transformed by the Industrial Revolution. The destruction of the opium at Human was supposed to end the crisis. Lin believed he had sent a clear message that China would no longer tolerate the drug trade, and that the foreign merchants would accept Chinese law and find legitimate goods to trade. He was catastrophically wrong. When news of the opium destruction reached London, there was outrage, not at the drug dealers but at the Chinese government for interfering with legitimate trade. Lord Palmerston, the British Foreign Secretary, declared that the Chinese must be taught that they could not injure British subjects with impunity. The British merchants, led by William Jardine, began lobbying for military action. They framed the issue not as a defense of the drug trade, but as a matter of national honor and free trade principles. They argued that British subjects had been illegally detained, their property confiscated without compensation, and their rights as free traders violated. It was a masterful propaganda campaign that transformed drug dealers into victims and turned a public health crisis into a trade dispute. The British government, already looking for an excuse to force China to open its markets, seized on the opium destruction as a casus belli. Lin Zexu, the incorruptible commissioner who had tried to save his country from a devastating drug epidemic, had unknowingly provided the British Empire with the justification it needed to go to war. The irony was bitter. In trying to protect China from opium, Lin had given the British the excuse they needed to force even more opium on his country. His moment of triumph, the destruction of 20,000 chests of drugs, would become the spark that ignited a war China could not win. As 1839 drew to a close, British warships were already sailing toward China. The First Opium War was about to begin, and with it the beginning of what the Chinese would later call their century of humiliation. Lin Zexu had fought the good fight, but he was about to learn that in the modern world, moral righteousness was no match for industrial firepower and imperial ambition. The first shots of the First Opium War were fired in November 1839, but the real battle had been decided long before any soldier pulled a trigger. This wasn't going to be a war between equals. It was going to be a demonstration of what happened when a medieval military met the Industrial Revolution. The Chinese military in 1839 was essentially unchanged from what it had been centuries earlier. Chinese soldiers carried matchlock muskets that took minutes to reload, wielded swords and spears, and wore armor that might have been impressive in the Ming dynasty, but was useless against modern weapons. Their ships were traditional junks, large wooden sailing vessels that were slow, unwieldy, and armed with cannons that could barely reach half a mile. The Chinese had numbers, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of ships, and the advantage of fighting on their home territory. What they didn't have was any understanding of how warfare had changed in the age of steam and steel. The British, on the other hand, brought the cutting edge of military technology. Their secret weapon was the HMS Nemesis, an iron-hulled steamship specifically built for this war. It drew only 6 feet of water, allowing it to navigate China's shallow coastal waters and rivers. It was armed with 2 32-pounder guns that could fire explosive shells, and it could move directly against the wind, belching black smoke like some monster from Chinese nightmares. The first major engagement came at the Battle of Chunpi in January 1841. Chinese war junks, arranged in a defensive formation, faced off against British ships in what should have been a traditional naval battle. Instead, it became a massacre. The Chinese opened fire first, their cannons booming across the water. Most of their shots fell short or bounced harmlessly off the British ships' iron hulls. In return, the British launched Congreve rockets, early guided missiles that screamed across the water before exploding among the Chinese fleet. Then the Nemesis opened fire with its explosive shells. These weren't solid cannonballs like the Chinese were used to. They were hollow iron projectiles filled with gunpowder that exploded on impact, sending deadly fragments in all directions. One Chinese ship exploded when a shell hit its powder magazine. Another caught fire and burned to the waterline. A third was torn apart by rockets, its crew jumping overboard to drown in their heavy armor. Within an hour, the Chinese fleet was destroyed or scattered. The Nemesis was barely scratched. This pattern repeated itself along the Chinese coast. At Tinghai, British forces captured the island's fortifications in a matter of hours. At Ningbo, Chinese defenders fled before the British even landed. At Qinghai, the supposedly impregnable fortress fell in a single day. The problem wasn't Chinese courage. Their soldiers fought bravely, often to the death. The problem was that they were fighting with weapons from the 16th century against an enemy equipped with 19th century technology. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, except the knife was actually a sword and the gun was actually a cannon. The British strategy was simple but devastating. Use naval power to bombard coastal defenses from a safe distance, then land troops to secure the area once resistance had been broken. The Chinese had no answer to this approach. Their coastal fortifications were designed to repel traditional attacks, not to withstand explosive shells fired from iron ships. The psychological impact was as important as the military one. Chinese soldiers had never seen ships that could move without wind, weapons that could explode after impact, or enemies who could strike from distances their own weapons couldn't reach. Many fled in panic, convinced they were fighting demons rather than men. The British moved methodically up the coast, capturing one port after another with minimal casualties. By 1842, they had reached the Yangtze River, China's great waterway, and the key to the empire's heartland. British gunboats sailed up the river with impunity, demonstrating that nowhere in China was truly safe from their reach. The climax came when British forces appeared before Nanjing, the southern capital and one of China's most important cities. The message was clear: surrender, or we'll march on Beijing itself. The Chinese government, finally recognizing the hopelessness of their situation, agreed to negotiate. The result was the Treaty of Nanking, signed aboard the HMS Cornwallis in August 1842. The terms were humiliating. China would pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, an astronomical sum that would bankrupt the imperial treasury. Hong Kong Island would be ceded to Britain in perpetuity. 5 ports would be open to British residents and trade. British citizens in China would no longer be subject to Chinese law, but would be governed by British courts. And though it wasn't explicitly stated in the treaty, everyone understood that the opium trade would continue unhindered. The First Opium War had lasted less than 3 years, but its impact would be felt for more than a century. China's image of itself as the center of civilization had been shattered. Its military had been exposed as obsolete. Its government had been forced to submit to barbarian demands. More importantly, the war had established a new principle in international relations: that industrial powers could use military force to open markets and impose their will on less developed nations. The Opium Wars weren't just about drugs, they were about the right of stronger nations to exploit weaker ones. For the British, the war was a complete success. They had opened Chinese markets, secured favorable trading terms, and established a permanent foothold in East Asia. The cost had been minimal. Fewer than 500 British casualties, mostly from disease rather than combat. For China, the war was a catastrophe that would echo through the generations. The Qing dynasty's mandate of heaven had been broken. The empire's borders had been violated, its people had been forced to accept foreign domination, and the opium kept flowing. In fact, with legal protection now guaranteed by treaty, the drug trade expanded rapidly. What had been 40,000 chests per year before the war became 70,000 chests by the 1850s. The addiction that had started the crisis was now worse than ever, protected by international law and British gunboats. The dragon had met the steam engine, and the dragon had lost. The age of Chinese dominance in East Asia was over. The age of Western imperialism had begun. You might think that after the devastating defeat of the First Opium War, the Chinese would have learned their lesson and accepted British dominance. You'd be wrong. The Chinese government, still reeling from the first conflict, found itself facing an even more humiliating Second War just 14 years later. The Second Opium War began in 1856 with an incident so trivial it seems almost absurd that it could spark an international conflict. Chinese officials in Canton boarded a Chinese-owned ship called the Arrow and arrested several crew members suspected of piracy. The ship was flying a British flag, probably illegally, and the British consul demanded the crew's release, claiming the vessel was under British protection. The Chinese authorities, noting that the ship was Chinese-owned and flying no flag at the time of boarding, refused. It was a minor incident, the kind of bureaucratic dispute that should have been resolved through diplomatic channels. Instead, it became the pretext for what would be an even more devastating war than the first. The British had been looking for an excuse to renegotiate the Treaty of Nanking. They wanted more ports opened, deeper access to China's interior, and most importantly, the complete legalization of the opium trade. The Arrow incident gave them the justification they needed, but this time they wouldn't be fighting alone. The French joined the conflict after a French missionary was executed in Guangxi province. Two industrial powers against one crumbling empire, the outcome was never in doubt. The Second Opium War was even more one-sided than the first. British and French forces easily overwhelmed Chinese defenses, capturing Canton and forcing the Chinese government to flee Beijing. But the most shocking moment came in October 1860, when British forces committed an act of cultural vandalism that would scar the Chinese psyche forever. The old summer palace, known as Yuanmingyuan, was the crown jewel of Chinese architecture and art. Built over 150 years, it was a vast complex of exquisite buildings, gardens, and priceless artifacts. It was China's Versailles, its Vatican, its Louvre, all rolled into one magnificent testament to Chinese civilization. When Chinese negotiators captured and tortured British envoys during peace talks, Lord Elgin, son of the man who took the Elgin marbles from Greece, ordered the palace's complete destruction as punishment. For 3 days, British and French troops systematically looted everything of value, then burned the rest to the ground. A French officer who witnessed the destruction wrote, "You could walk only on precious objects. It was necessary to walk over porcelain, bronzes, rich stuffs, precious stones." 2 centuries of Chinese cultural heritage went up in flames in a deliberate act of cultural terrorism. The psychological impact was devastating. This wasn't just military defeat. It was a direct attack on Chinese civilization itself. The message was clear. Even China's greatest cultural achievements were not worthy of respect or preservation. The treaties that ended the Second Opium War were even harsher than those that concluded the first. The Treaty of Tientsin and the Convention of Peking opened 10 more ports to foreign trade, allowed foreigners to travel freely in China's interior, gave Christian missionaries protection for their activities, explicitly legalized the opium trade, and imposed another crushing indemnity. Perhaps most symbolically painful, foreign diplomats gained the right to reside in Beijing itself, the sacred capital that had been largely closed to barbarians for centuries. The Son of Heaven would now have to receive representatives of foreign powers as equals, a final repudiation of the tributary system that had placed China at the center of its world. By 1860, China had been transformed from a proud, independent empire into what historians call a semi-colonial state. Foreign powers controlled its ports, dictated its trade policies, and could use military force to enforce their will. The opium that had started as a smuggling problem was now a legal trade protected by international treaties. The human cost was staggering. Opium addiction had spread throughout Chinese society, from the imperial court to the humblest peasant village. Entire regions were economically devastated as people chose drugs over food, opium over work. The social fabric that had held Chinese civilization together for millennia was unraveling. The Qing dynasty, once the most powerful government on earth, was now a hollow shell. Its military was obsolete, its treasury empty, its authority undermined by foreign interference. The emperor still sat on the dragon throne, but real power lay with the foreign consuls and merchants who dictated China's policies from their comfortable compounds in the treaty ports. The opium trade, now legal and protected, exploded to unprecedented levels. By the 1880s, China was importing over 80,000 chests of opium annually, more than 11 million pounds of drugs flooding into the country every year. Domestic production had also begun, as Chinese farmers, seeing the profits to be made, started growing poppies themselves. The irony was bitter. The Chinese government, having failed to keep foreign opium out, now found itself taxing domestic opium production to raise revenue. The drug that had been banned as a threat to Chinese society was now a source of government income. The Second Opium War marked the point of no return for imperial China. The First War had been a shock, a wake-up call that could potentially have led to reform and modernization. The Second War was a death sentence, a demonstration that China was helpless before Western industrial power. The psychological trauma ran deep. Chinese intellectuals began to question everything: their government, their culture, their entire way of life. If the Middle Kingdom could be so easily defeated by barbarians, what did that say about Chinese civilization? If Confucian values and traditional learning were powerless against Western guns and ships, what was the point of preserving them? This crisis of confidence would plague China for the next century. The country that had once seen itself as the center of the world now saw itself as the sick man of Asia, weak, divided, and at the mercy of foreign powers. The Opium Wars had achieved something that no previous invasion or rebellion had managed. They had broken China's spirit. The dragon had not just been defeated. It had been humiliated, carved up, and forced to participate in its own destruction. And still, the opium kept flowing. The aftermath of the Opium Wars was like watching a slow-motion collapse of one of history's greatest civilizations. China in the 1860s and 1870s was a country in free fall, battered by foreign aggression, internal rebellion, and the ongoing devastation of mass drug addiction. The most immediate consequence was the complete breakdown of the traditional Chinese economy. For centuries, China had operated on a silver standard. Its currency was backed by precious metal that flowed in from trade with the outside world. But now that silver was flowing out to pay for opium, the entire monetary system collapsed. Imagine if the US dollar suddenly lost half its value in just a few years. That's what the Chinese were experiencing. Prices soared, wages plummeted, and ordinary people found themselves unable to afford basic necessities. The government, already struggling to pay the massive indemnities imposed by the Western powers, found it increasingly difficult to collect taxes from an impoverished population. The social impact was even more devastating. Opium addiction had spread from the coastal cities deep into China's interior. In some villages, entire populations were addicted. Fields lay fallow because farmers were too drugged to work. Workshops sat empty because craftsmen had sold their tools to buy opium. The family, the foundation of Chinese life for centuries, began to crumble from within. Parents who once worked tirelessly for their children now found themselves trading away the small comforts of the household just to satisfy their cravings. A father might quietly sell the tools he relied on to feed his family. A mother might part with the few treasured possessions she had, a silver hairpin, a jade bracelet, telling herself it was only this once. Meanwhile, their children waited for meals that never came, watching the warmth of family life seep away as addiction hollowed out the people they depended on most. The government's response was pathetic and contradictory. Officials who weren't themselves addicted to opium were often corrupt, taking bribes from drug dealers while publicly condemning the trade. Those who tried to enforce anti-opium laws found themselves fighting not just foreign merchants but their own subordinates, many of whom were either addicted or profiting from the trade. The Qing dynasty's legitimacy, already damaged by military defeat, was further undermined by its inability to protect its people from what was obviously a foreign-imposed plague. The mandate of heaven, the traditional justification for imperial rule, required the emperor to maintain harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. Mass drug addiction was hardly harmonious. This crisis of legitimacy sparked a series of devastating rebellions that would claim tens of millions of lives. The most destructive was the Taiping Rebellion, led by Hong Xiuquan, a failed scholar who became convinced he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to rid China of both the Manchu demons, who ruled as the Qing dynasty, and the foreign devils, who pushed their opium and religion. The Taiping Rebellion lasted from 1850 to 1864 and was the deadliest civil war in human history, claiming an estimated 20 to 30 million lives. It was directly connected to the opium crisis. Hong's movement gained support precisely because the Qing government had proven unable to protect China from foreign exploitation. But the Taiping Rebellion was just one of many uprisings that rocked China in the aftermath of the Opium Wars. The Nian Rebellion in the north, the Muslim rebellions in the southwest, the small sword society in Shanghai, all reflected the weakening grip of a dynasty that had lost the mandate of heaven in the eyes of many of its subjects. Meanwhile, the Western powers continued to carve up China like a melon. Russia seized vast territories in the north. Germany claimed Shandong province. France took control of parts of the southwest. Britain expanded from Hong Kong into the new territories. Each new concession further weakened Chinese sovereignty and demonstrated the government's helplessness. The most humiliating moment came in 1900 with the Boxer Rebellion, when rural militias rose up against foreign influence, particularly missionaries. Initially supported by the Qing court under Empress Dowager Cixi, the rebellion became yet another disaster when a multinational force of 20,000 troops from 8 nations crushed the poorly armed Boxers and occupied Beijing. The resulting Boxer Protocol of 1901 forced China to pay yet another crippling indemnity, 450 million taels of silver, more than the government's annual revenue, to be paid over 39 years with interest. Foreign troops gained the right to be permanently stationed in Beijing. The final humiliation of the once mighty empire was complete. By this point, opium had become so entrenched in Chinese society that the government had given up trying to ban it. Instead, they began taxing it as a source of revenue. The drug that had been condemned as a threat to Chinese civilization was now helping to fund what remained of the Chinese state. Domestic opium production had also exploded. Chinese farmers, seeing the profits to be made, began growing poppies on a massive scale. By the end of the 19th century, China was producing 85% of the opium consumed within its borders. The country had become not just a victim of the drug trade, but a participant in it. The intellectual and cultural impact was equally profound. Chinese scholars and reformers began to question everything about their civilization. If China could be so easily defeated by Western barbarians, what did that say about Chinese culture, Chinese values, Chinese learning? Some, like the reformer Kang Youwei, argued for gradual modernization while preserving Chinese essence. Others, like the revolutionary Sun Yat-sen, called for the complete overthrow of the imperial system and the creation of a modern republic. Still others, overwhelmed by the scale of China's humiliation, retreated into nostalgia for a golden age that seemed increasingly distant and irrelevant. The Opium Wars had done more than defeat China militarily. They had shattered Chinese confidence in their own civilization. The country that had once seen itself as the center of the world now saw itself as backward, weak, and inferior to the West. This psychological trauma would shape Chinese thinking for the next century and beyond. The determination to never again be humiliated by foreign powers would drive Chinese policy through the Republican period, the Communist Revolution, and into the modern era. The Qing dynasty limped on until 1911, when the Jinhai Revolution finally ended over 2,000 years of imperial rule. The last emperor, Puyi, was just 6 years old when he abdicated. The empire that had once controlled a third of the world's wealth had collapsed, brought down by a flower and the greed of foreign merchants. But the legacy of the Opium Wars lived on. The treaties signed under duress, the territorial concessions, the principle that China could be forced to accept foreign domination. All of this would continue to shape China's relationship with the outside world long after the last emperor had left the Forbidden City. The dragon had fallen, and it would take more than a century for it to rise again. As we reach the end of our journey through this dark chapter of history, it's important to understand that the Opium Wars didn't just end with treaties and territorial concessions. Their impact echoed through the next century and continues to shape China's worldview today. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The new Republic of China, established in 1912, inherited a country devastated by addiction, divided by foreign spheres of influence, and traumatized by a century of humiliation. The Republican government struggled to unite the country and resist Japanese aggression, all while dealing with the ongoing opium crisis. Even as late as the 1930s, opium remained a massive problem in China. Warlords grew rich from taxing the trade. The Japanese, during their occupation of Manchuria and later much of eastern China, actively promoted opium addiction as a way of weakening Chinese resistance. Government efforts to suppress the drug competed with the need for revenue and the reality of widespread corruption. It wasn't until the communist victory in 1949 that China finally managed to effectively end the opium epidemic that had begun with those British merchant ships in the early 19th century. Through harsh suppression, mass treatment programs, and fundamental social reorganization, the People's Republic accomplished what the Qing dynasty could not: the eradication of widespread opium addiction. But the psychological scars remained. The century of humiliation became a foundational narrative in modern Chinese identity, taught in schools, referenced in speeches, and embedded in the national consciousness. The lesson drawn was clear and stark. Weakness invites aggression. China must never again be vulnerable to foreign powers. This brings us back to where we began. A nation that once dominated world trade, that considered itself the center of civilization, that needed nothing from barbarian states, was brought low not primarily by military defeat, but by a flower, by a drug that weakened it from within, while creating the very crisis that led to external intervention. The British writer Samuel Taylor Coleridge, himself an opium addict, once wrote of a stately pleasure dome in Xanadu, ancient China, where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man down to a sunless sea. His poem captures something of opium's allure, the beautiful dreams that lead to darkness. For China, opium created not pleasure domes but national catastrophe. The sacred rivers of its civilization ran down to a sunless sea of addiction, humiliation, and decline. The Celestial Empire descended into a century of darkness from which it has only recently begun to emerge. The story of the Opium Wars reminds us of human frailty, our vulnerability to addiction, whether to substances, power, or wealth. It shows how systems can fail gradually, almost imperceptibly, until suddenly the structures that seemed eternal crumble before our eyes. But it also contains hope. China, after a century of struggle, has reclaimed its sovereignty and rebuilt its strength. The nation that once fell to opium has risen again, becoming once more a major power on the world stage. Perhaps that's the final lesson of this dark historical tale. Empires fall, nations suffer, but people endure. They learn, they rebuild, and sometimes they even forgive, though they never forget. The weight of history is heavy, but it need not be crushing. The Opium Wars were a tragedy, but they were not the end of China's story. They were a chapter, a dark and painful chapter, in the long history of a civilization that has survived invasions, rebellions, famines, and foreign domination. Today, as we face our own challenges with addiction, with the abuse of power, with the exploitation of the weak by the strong, the story of the Opium Wars offers both warning and wisdom. It reminds us that no nation, no matter how powerful, is immune to the consequences of moral failure. It shows us that the pursuit of profit without regard for human cost leads inevitably to tragedy. But it also demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for recovery and renewal, and the possibility that even the darkest chapters can eventually give way to new beginnings. The opium poppy still grows in fields around the world. The temptation to exploit others for profit still exists. The powerful still sometimes prey upon the weak. But the story of China's century of humiliation and eventual recovery reminds us that such exploitation carries a price, not just for the victims, but ultimately for the perpetrators as well. In the end, The Opium Wars teach us that true strength comes not from the ability to impose one's will on others, but from the wisdom to build relationships based on mutual respect and benefit. The British may have won the wars, but they lost something more important: the opportunity to build a genuine partnership with one of the world's great civilizations. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember this story not as ancient history, but as a living reminder of the choices we face in our own time. The world turns, night follows day, and eventually even the darkest chapters come to an end. The candle of consciousness flickers and dims, but the lessons of history burn on, lighting the way for future generations who must navigate their own challenges with wisdom gained from the past. Sleep well, knowing that you've traveled through one of history's most consequential yet often overlooked stories: how a flowering plant brought low the world's greatest empire, and how the repercussions of that fall continue to shape our world today. The story is told, the lessons learned, and now it's time to rest in the peaceful darkness that follows. The echoes of the Opium Wars still reverberate today in ways both obvious and subtle. When Chinese leaders speak of national rejuvenation, when they emphasize sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs, when they approach international relations with a mixture of confidence and wariness, they are responding to lessons learned during those dark decades of the 19th century. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's massive infrastructure project spanning continents, can be seen as an attempt to reverse the historical flow of exploitation, to be the one building ports and railways in other countries, rather than having foreign powers carve up Chinese territory. The emphasis on win-win cooperation reflects a conscious rejection of the zero-sum imperialism that once devastated China. Even China's approach to drug policy bears the mark of this history. The country maintains some of the world's harshest penalties for drug trafficking, executing more drug dealers annually than the rest of the world combined. This isn't just about public health, it's about national security, rooted in the understanding that drugs can be weapons used to destroy societies from within. The irony is that today, it's often Chinese-made fentanyl that's devastating communities in America and Europe, creating addiction crises that echo China's own historical trauma. The wheel of history has turned, but the fundamental dynamics remain the same. The powerful exploit the weak, addiction destroys lives, and the consequences ripple across generations. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Opium Wars is about the danger of cultural arrogance and the importance of adaptation. The Qing dynasty's initial response to Western pressure was to retreat into isolation and tradition, convinced that Chinese civilization was superior and that the barbarians would eventually go away. This attitude, while understandable, proved catastrophic when faced with the realities of industrial-age power. The Chinese eventually learned to adapt, to borrow what was useful from foreign cultures while maintaining their own identity. The process was painful and took more than a century, but it ultimately allowed China to reclaim its place as a major world power. The lesson applies not just to nations, but to individuals and organizations. The ability to learn, adapt, and change is essential for survival in a rapidly evolving world. As we close this long journey through one of history's most tragic conflicts, it's worth reflecting on what it means for us today. We live in an interconnected world where the actions of one nation can have profound consequences for others. The drugs that destroyed Chinese society in the 19th century were produced in British-controlled India and sold by British merchants, but the addiction and suffering were experienced by Chinese families. Today's global challenges, climate change, pandemics, economic inequality, the spread of misinformation, require the same kind of international cooperation that was so tragically absent during the Opium Wars. The alternative is a world where the strong continue to exploit the weak, where short-term profits take precedence over long-term consequences, and where the cycle of exploitation and revenge continues to turn. The story of the Opium Wars is ultimately a story about choices. The choice to prioritize profit over human welfare, the choice to use force rather than negotiation, the choice to exploit rather than cooperate. These same choices face us today in different forms, and the lessons of history can guide us toward better decisions. As the night deepens and your eyelids grow heavy, let the weight of this history settle gently into your consciousness. The Opium Wars were not just about China and Britain, not just about the 19th century, not just about drugs and trade. They were about fundamental questions of power, morality, and human nature that remain relevant today. The poppy fields of Afghanistan still produce opium that flows into the veins of addicts around the world. Pharmaceutical companies still push addictive drugs while downplaying their dangers. Powerful nations still use economic pressure to force weaker countries to accept unfavorable terms. The specific details change, but the underlying patterns persist. Yet there is also hope in this story. China's recovery from its century of humiliation shows that even the most devastating defeats need not be permanent. Nations can learn, adapt, and rebuild. Civilizations can survive their darkest hours and emerge stronger. The human capacity for resilience, for learning from mistakes, for choosing cooperation over conflict, remains our greatest asset in facing the challenges of our own time. The last opium den in China closed decades ago. The foreign concessions have been returned to Chinese control. The unequal treaties have been abrogated. The dragon has risen again, not through conquest or revenge, but through the patient work of rebuilding, reforming, and rejoining the community of nations as an equal partner. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without cost. Millions died in wars, revolutions, and famines during China's long struggle to regain its strength and dignity. But the ultimate victory was not military or economic. It was moral and spiritual. China proved that a nation could overcome even the most devastating humiliation and reclaim its rightful place in the world. As you drift toward sleep, carried by the gentle rhythm of your breathing and the soft sounds of the night, remember that history is not just about the past. It's about the future we choose to create. The lessons of the Opium Wars, painful as they are, can help us build a world where such tragedies need not be repeated. The flower that once brought down an empire still blooms in fields around the world, but its power to destroy need not be absolute. Human wisdom, human compassion, and human cooperation can overcome even the darkest chapters of our shared history. Sleep now, knowing that you've witnessed one of history's great tragedies and triumphs, the fall and rise of a civilization, the power of a plant to change the world, and the ultimate resilience of the human spirit. The story is complete, the lessons learned, and tomorrow brings new opportunities to apply that wisdom in our own lives and times. The night is peaceful, the history is told, and the future remains unwritten. Rest well in the knowledge that understanding the past helps us navigate the present and build a better tomorrow. The Opium Wars are over, but their lessons live on, guiding us toward a world where strength serves justice, where power protects the vulnerable, and where the mistakes of the past light the way to a brighter future. Sweet dreams, and may you wake refreshed and ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow may bring, armed with the wisdom of history and the hope of human progress.